This is their act of defiance. And so, yes, it is a tragic story, but within this tragic story, there is so much to be proud of, so much to think about.
My guest today is Jonathan Brent, an academic and historian who serves as the executive director and CEO of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, a cultural organization and place of higher learning with a world-renowned library and archive whose mission is to preserve, study, share, and perpetuate knowledge of the history and culture of East European Jewry worldwide. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Lovely to be here, Ellie.
Really, really glad to have you here. So let's start with YIVO because it's quite a remarkable thing. Can you tell us a bit about the history of YIVO from its founding nearly a century ago in Europe as the Yiddish Scientific Institute to its current dwellings in New York City?
Mm-hmm. Yiddish Scientific Institute, Yiddischer Wissenschaftlicher Institute. That was the name of YIVO. Had great ambition when it started out. And the word Wissenschaft, of course, connects it to the German Wissenschaft des Judentums. And so it had real ambition to be a research institute modeled on German precedents of rigor and science. Science at the time included history and the social sciences. And that's what YIVO was. It was started in 1925 in Berlin, not in Vilna or Vilnius, but in Berlin by a group of scholars who thought the time had come for the teaching of advanced Jewish studies in Eastern Europe, which, unlike German and French and Anglo Jewry, had not really benefited from the advances in knowledge and in research methodologies, and where the great masses of people really didn't even know many of the fundamental things about their own culture, their history, their music, their literature, their art, and their language. Yiddish was thought to be a dialect of German, a jargon. Even Sholem Aleichem calls it a jargon, a jargon. And the ambition of YIVO was to show that Yiddish was a language in and unto itself, a language like English, mainly like English or Dutch, for instance. Max Weinreich calls it a fusion language that smashes together many elements from many different languages, but it is a language unto itself. Why? Because East European Jewry was a people unto itself. It was a people with a history and a culture and a language and traditions that needed to be preserved and needed to be celebrated and understood. In 1925, why? Assimilation, emigration to the United States, simple forgetting of our roots. And furthermore, much had been done in languages that a lot of people might not have been completely familiar with, such as Romanian or Hungarian or dialects of Polish or German or other Slavic languages. And so a lot of the culture was not even known to the people themselves. And so it was started in 1925 in Berlin, in Warsaw, and in Vilna. But in Vilna, Max Weinreich had which was the center that was going to deal mainly with philology. Weinreich in an effort to create a an understanding of what the Yiddish language was, began what was called a Sammler movement, a collecting movement. People would go out and collect all the language, all the words. There was no dictionary of Yiddish, you understand. Collect the words, find out what our vocabulary really is, and bring them back. And so the Sammler, the collecting movement got started, and this eventually became the collecting not just of language, but of artifacts, of documents. Send us your poetry, send us your novels, send us your plays, send us your political posters, Yiddish theater. And consequently, from 1925 to 1940, when the Nazis rolled into Vilna, YIVO became the greatest archive of Jewish life of Eastern Europe anywhere in the world.
Wow.
24 million documents are currently in our possession, in our archive in New York.
24 million?
24 million.
I can't even comprehend that
Yes.
number. That's immense.
It's immense.
How can people access the archive? What sorts of things might people see there? And are there any collections that are particularly exciting for you personally?
Oh, first of all, it's a wonderland. It includes the organizational records of Grossinger's Country Club. It contains the sermons of Rabbi Schneerson. It contains rarest Hasidic manuscripts of the 18th century, and it includes a shund, sort of pulp Yiddish theater. We have 500 operettas in Yiddish that have never been performed in the United States. We have materials about the Russian Revolution and about all of the revolutionary movements in Eastern Europe, because we have the entire archive of the Bund. We have a vast collection of material on the pogroms in the Ukraine of the 1920s, which is, many scholars think, and I agree, was forecasting the Holocaust, these pogroms that swept the Ukraine. We have poetry, diaries of children, autobiographies. We have the complete medical records of the most beloved physician in Vilna, Tzemach Shabbat. So if your grandfather or great-grandfather was from Vilna, chances are we would find out what his childhood illnesses were, or how his parents cared for him. We have educational records. In other words, we have the report cards. Again, if your grandfather was from Vilna, we could have his report card. You could see with the comments of the teachers, good student, terrible. In one report card, the student says, this kid was so unruly, I had to throw him across the classroom. So it's a gold mine. It's a gold mine. We have material from the Water Carriers Union, and we have material from the greatest of the yeshivot. My own center of interest is largely in Soviet studies. This is what I've focused on in Isaac Babel, and in that literature that is right on the edge between Jewish, Russian, and Yiddish. You have to remember that Sholem Aleichem wanted to write in Russian, to be a great Russian writer, but he realized to reach the folk, he had to write in Yiddish. Well, materials that we have that pertain to this dividing line, this very, very perilous moment in which Jews are becoming citizens of a bigger world, is very fascinating to me. The artists, the writers, the thinkers, the political figures, and so on and so forth. And we have tremendous materials on this in the archive of Yitzhak Nachman Steinberg, and in the Bund archive, and in many other Holocausts.
If people want to see this, is this like a physical library in New York City, or is it online? How can people access this?
It's a physical library in New York City. Come to New York and you can see the actual materials. Or we have now digitized the complete pre-war collection. This is a monumental achievement. It's 1.5 million pages of documents and I believe 12,000 books, completely digitized and online. So if you are in Moscow, if you are in Buenos Aires, if you are in London or New York, you can all look at the same document at the same time. And it includes, just tremendous insight into what that world was. It includes the autobiographies of these young people in the 1930s. It includes the whole library of the Ukrainian pogroms, the Cherikover archive. It includes the Yiddish theater. It includes posters. I believe 4,000 posters that had never been seen before have been digitized, big, oversized materials that have never been put on display. So it's a wonderland and it's all available online. Just log on to YIVO, go to Vilna Collections Project or digitized materials and search them. If you know Yiddish, if you know Russian, if you know Polish, if you know German, if you know French, and there's some in English. Since most people don't know these languages, we have now constructed an online museum where we take tranches of materials, put them in context, and translate them into English. So for the first time, if you don't know Yiddish, you will be able to read these autobiographies of these young people. You will be able to read the diary of little Bebe Epstein, for instance, who was 13 years old. What chutzpah she had. She submits her memoir at the age of 13 to the YIVO autobiography contest, which is for 18 to 21-year-olds. But who cares? It's Bebe Epstein. And she gets a voice. Everybody gets a voice. And these diaries are fantastically interesting. Let me give you one example. She writes in her diary about the first movie in the Yiddish Jewish movie theater in Vilna. What is it? It is not Sholem Aleichem. It is not the Dibuk. It is not in Yiddish. It is not anything that you might immediately think of. It is in Vilna in 1931, I believe, the silent version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, the insight that gives you into the community, into the ambition of the community, into the thinking outside, into the outside world of the community is fantastic. In a corner of her memoir, she writes, well, I really want to go to college, but owing to the anti-Semitism in Poland now, because Vilna was in Poland at the time, I'm not sure I'll be able to study here. I think I'll go to Paris. This is a 13-year-old girl saying to herself, I think I'll go to Paris. I didn't think I was going to go to Paris to study. It was even kind of out of the question in my family that I come to New York to study. So, what does this tell you about that little world that is so often written off as illiterate, as uneducated, as lost in a world of nostalgia and superstition and so on and so forth? These materials show us who we are as people, where we came from, where you came from, where I came from.
Yeah, it's really a glimpse in the past that for the first time ever people have this kind of access to. And for our listeners who
Yes.
may not be so familiar with Jewish history, but they want to learn more, I mean, where do they even start? Where's the best place to start?
Well, it's you can, it's a Jewish thing. So there's no beginning and there's no end. let me assure you, there's no end to this. This story has not been written in full yet. So you start in the middle. You start wherever you start. You start by putting on your shoes in the morning. And so wherever you start, you will find your way towards something. Whether it is in the Landsmannschaften books that we have, looking for your ancestor, and then trying to find out what was the community like. You know, a lot of people are so obsessed with ancestry.com as if telling you what your DNA is, exactly the street corner your grandmother came from. This tells you who you are. What an impoverished understanding of who you are is. What we have tells you what was the world out of which those individuals came, the traditions, and not just the ones that Abraham Joshua Heschel writes about, or the ones in Tevye the Dairyman, but the actual concrete life that they came out of.
Yeah.
So you get an insight. It fills up that emptiness that so many Jews in in America at least feel about who they are culturally. Of course, religiously, there's Tanakh, Talmud, so religion. But as Shimon Dubnov wrote in the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, Judaism is not just a religion. It is a religion and a culture that is tied together with historical memory. And if it only becomes a religion, it is only half of what it should be. YIVO provides that other half. It's not just lox and bagels, let me assure you on Sundays. Let me assure you.
I mean, this is such a great portal into the past. Now, I've got to ask you, what do your archives tell you about how East European Jewry responded to anti-Semitism over the centuries?
Well, you know, Hannah Arendt did a great disservice to Jewish memory in Eichmann in Jerusalem when she wrote about the leadership of the communities uh, as being collaborators, that the Jews went to their deaths as sheep to the slaughter. This is such a terrible slander against our ancestors who actually, you have to remember, they had no army, they had no police, they had no means, they didn't have guns. What did they have? They had the resilience. They had inner resilience. So, yes, they had to bear the brunt of whatever blows were meted out to them. But it was that inner resilience, the cultural resistance, that is so clearly represented in these materials. The Jewish people of Eastern Europe responded largely through trying to organize their societies to cope with these outbreaks of anti-Semitism. Yes, but how do you cope when you have no organized police force? It was only toward the end of the 19th century that Shimon Dubnov called for Jewish defense committees to be established because he could tell that it was getting worse and it would get much worse in the future. And so we have photographs of these Jewish defense committees throughout the Pale of Settlement. But what could they do when there were thousands, tens of thousands of angry Ukrainians or Lithuanians or Romanians, let alone the Nazis that came? What could they actually do? So what did they do? Many became partisans. And one of the fantastic things that has come out of the materials that we have is the diary of Yitzhak Rudashevsky, a young boy, again, 13 years old, who wrote his diary in the Vilna ghetto. And he talks about how what they are doing in the Vilna ghetto in retaining their traditions in singing songs and having literary events, in putting on music, on reading poetry and writing poetry, how this is defying the Nazis. This is their act of defiance. And so, yes, it is a tragic story, but within this tragic story, there is so much to be proud of, so much to think about in terms of how, as a small people, and come on, we have great ambition, but we are really a small people in this world, how one deals with these forces that are growing. In the 1920s, there was Bolshevism to the east and Nazism to the west, and America would not let Jews in. And what could you do? You were stuck. You were stuck. The world would not let Jews in. We have a fantastic cartoon from the 1920s from a Yiddish newspaper of this Jewish guy with a sack over his back, and he's walking, trying to find a place for himself. And where he's walking, it's a field of bayonets. And on every bayonet, mind you, this is 1924, on every bayonet, there's the name of another country: United States, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Poland, Russia. Nowhere, nobody would take them. What are they going to do? And so instead of just lying down and doing nothing, as Hannah Arendt points out or argues, they resisted in the ways that they could. And thank God that they did, because that resistance gave them dignity. And it is that is the thread that connects us to them. That dignity, that pride that they had in being who they are.
Mm. Yeah, we've heard recently, it comes up time now and again about the argument about sheep to a slaughter, and I really can't stand it. It makes me feel quite ill, and I really don't. I just think it's completely inappropriate, especially when it comes from Jewish people.
Yes,
I think an often overlooked aspect in the mainstream discussion surrounding the Holocaust are the purposes of Yizker Birkher, which, for listeners who may not know, can be broadly described, correct me if I'm wrong, as memorial books which commemorate various Jewish communities that were largely lost during the Holocaust. How did Yizker Birkher come about, and how widely used were they?
they have. It is a remarkably widely used resource of YIVO. We have hundreds of them.
Mm.
It came about because people who survived wanted to find their relatives. I mean, that was the initial thing. And they would go back to their town, and they would go here and they would go there, and they would hear stories. And they just started writing these things down in these books. It became, it was, as far as I know, and I'm not a scholar of Yizker Birkher, I assure you, but as far as I know, it was a spontaneous need to record a vanished, erased, destroyed, mutilated, murdered past. It was another act of resistance. You could no longer say, here I am, but here I was. Here we were. And the consequence of it was tremendously moving, extraordinarily important records of these towns. Of course, in Russia, in the Soviet Union, Ehrenburg, Ilya Ehrenburg, and Vasily Grossman made a Yizker book, for the whole of the Soviet Union, and it was called the Black Book. And they went country by country by country by country throughout Europe, Eastern Europe, Soviet side of Europe, and they interviewed people, and they used these materials to create an understanding of what these communities had been, how they were destroyed, who lived there. on which street corners did people live, who killed them, or what became of them. And of course, it was suppressed. The publication of it was suppressed by Stalin, and only recently was it published, and then a revised edition published again.
You know, it's so important that the YIVO does archive all of these things, because Hitler's main goal was to wipe out Jews and Jewish culture. And so you to speak about this act of resistance, the information is the resistance to, as you say that we were here and here's the proof. And, you know, in a time when the president of the United States has to make a statement that says, just so everyone is clear, the Holocaust really happened, the Holocaust is real, I can't think of a more important resource than YIVO.
Yeah, yeah. Holocaust denial is one thing, and it's repulsive. But a recent survey in the United States has shown that some huge percentage, and I am not clear exactly how much, but it's certainly, I think, over 40% of American citizens have never even heard of the Holocaust.
Wow.
And so this is not denial. It's simply complete for emptiness. It's emptiness. And our job is to fill that emptiness to the extent that we can. And our online museum is a way of doing this. The online museum is now being used in schools throughout the United States, in South Africa, in Australia. It has been shown in England. And it is introducing students of many different backgrounds to this history of the Jewish people. And interestingly, I got a note from a teacher at Stuyvesant High School in New York City, not a Jewish school, who's one of her honor students is a refugee from East Asia, Vietnam or Cambodia, I'm not sure, Southeast Asia. And she wrote about the online museum. She said, when I read about Beba Epstein's attempts at emigrating, I immediately understood it was my experience as well. And so this is really, and she had never known of the Holocaust or anything. But yes, when we have a president who has to say that the Holocaust actually happened, you know that we are in great danger as a nation, and I'm sure this is not only in the United States, of losing something that the study of which and the memory of which is essential for understanding who we are today. You have to understand this phenomenon of the Holocaust to grasp what is going on in white nationalist anti-Semitic movements in America, in France, in Germany, elsewhere. And what also is going on with Putin. This is, you know, essential to understand. Putin says he's trying to destroy Ukraine because they're fascists. Well, if you don't know,
denazify you, yeah.
You know, you have to understand the background of this.
Let's talk about that, because you know you mentioned that one of your key interests was the Soviet Union, and you know anti-Semitism and militant anti-Zionism, which often, you know, the line is very blurred. This is not a new thing. You know, on university campuses in the States, and certainly over here, we are seeing anti-Zionist rhetoric very, very easily bleed into blatant anti-Semitic rhetoric. And I don't need to tell you that this really stems from the Soviet Union. Could you tell us a bit about that, and how was Jewish identity seen as a threat to the Soviet Union?
Well, there are many tributaries that contribute to all of this. We won't go into them. But in 1948, after the war, let us say, Stalin became very aware of two things. One, that the United States of America, not England, but the United States of America was now the global enemy of the Soviet Union. And two, that the Jews of the Soviet Union had incipient nationalist ambition with the establishment of the state of Israel, and nationalism of the many different peoples of the Soviet Union was, in his view, and you have to remember that before the revolution, he was assigned by Lenin to study the nationalist question. He was the head of the nationalist department of the Bolshevik. And he devised policies to deal with all of the different peoples. The Soviet Union was a vast multinational state, and he understood that if they start breaking apart, what you would see is what finally happened in 1991. The Estonians, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, they all become their own states. The Kazakhs, the Tatars, they all want their own states. And here are the Jews who, with the establishment of the state of Israel, start understanding that they could have their own state. And the Jews also are a unique people in the Soviet Union because they have relatives in Israel, but they also have relatives in the United States. Molotov's wife was Jewish, Jemchuzhina. She was a fierce, uncompromising Stalinist. Even though he exiled her, threw her out of the party, she remained a Stalinist to the end of her days. Her brother was pumping gas in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Think of it. This is a threat. Why? Because he is fearful that Jews will be hearing from their relatives in the United States about what conditions are in the United States, or from their relatives in Israel, and so on and so forth. Now, this is to a great extent paranoia on Stalin's part. As a famous poet, who was eventually shot as part of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee trial in 1951, said to the court, he said, how could I harbor any animosity whatsoever toward the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union saved my people. You liberated Auschwitz and other camps, destroyed the Nazis, the greatest threat to the Jewish people. And he said, Stalin has done more to save the Jewish people of anybody since the time of the Roman kings. So Stalin's paranoia was misplaced, but it arose from this. And what Stalin did was, therefore, begin a campaign in 1948, the purpose of which was to wipe out, erase, destroy Jewish culture and Jewish memory in the Soviet Union, in order to get Jews in the Soviet Union to think of themselves not as Jews, but as Soviets. This was a very important part of his overall strategy. Now, the anti-Semitic campaign, what Stalin added to anti-Semitism, he actually added something. He wasn't just using the protocols of the Elders of Zion. and the blood libel and all of the other horrible things to make his point about the Jews. His point about the Jews was that they were agents of the United States of America. So for the first time in the history of anti-Semitism, the Jews are not being attacked just as Jews for religious reasons or for, crazy superstitious reasons or whatever, or economic reasons. It's not that the Jews have all the money as they had in Paris and in the 1200s, and that's why they had to be expelled and so on and so forth, or because the church or the Crusaders need to get back their estates and their standing. It has to do with Stalin's attack on America, on the United States of America, and underlying all of the rhetoric of Israel and Zionism is an undercurrent of antagonism toward what was thought of as American power. And the left in America and in England and the progressive left in Europe all absorbed this into their bloodstream, that the Jews are dangerous because they represent America. Now, this, however, does not also exclude the age-old protocols of the elders of Zion, blood libel, you name it. Stalin brought all of it together into a single campaign. And this campaign spread throughout all of the Soviet Union. And it was then this campaign, Jews represent America, that gets pumped into the Middle East, into Arafat, along with all of the other anti-Semitic canards that they learned from the Mufti of Jerusalem, who had been an ally of Hitler's. And the two things have become the core of contemporary anti-Semitism. This is why it is so difficult to deal with. On the one hand, when Jews are being attacked as Zionists, America is really the object of the attack. And it's easier for you to attack Israel and Jews on the basis of what? Oppressing, colonialization, blah, 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 than it is to attack them on the basis of the blood libel or the protocols of the elders of Zion or on any other hocus pocus that you want to invent. And it makes this modern anti-Semitism, furthermore, a highly politicized subject. And that's why it's important to understand this. It is highly politicized.
Right.
Now, the right, that's on the left. The right has its own set of complaints against the Jews. Mainly, they want America to be a white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, pure, nationalistic country. That's, and their anti-Semitism goes back a long way. It has to do with eugenics and their fear that the Jews are too powerful and, and all of that. But on the left, we have this new thing to deal with, the politicization of anti-Semitism as a weapon against the United States. And of course, Israel becomes the proxy for the United States.
Right. Right. I think what's so interesting is that people on the far right will make these wild accusations and tropes against Jewish people, but they will say, yeah, of course I'm anti-Semitic, I don't like Jewish people, but the people on the left will not do that. And I want to ask, why do you think it is that comparisons between Nazis and Israel, or Nazis and Zionists, which are anti-Semitism under the international definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition, it manages to not only go undetected as anti-Jewish racism from so-called progressives, but it is actually brandished as being, quote, not anti-Semitic, just anti-Zionist. A quote I'm sure many of our listeners will have seen and many Jews will be familiar with online. So how has this trope been managed to been marketed in this way?
All right, let me give you let me tell you a story that helped,
Please.
to my mind, explain this. I was at a conference in Vienna in 1990 or the early 2000s, and at that conference there was a Czech woman who had been a dissident and had been arrested in the 70s in Czechoslovakia at the time. And she got up, and one of the scholars who happened to be there was the head of a women's organization in Canada. And this Czech scholar looked directly at her, and she said, why, during the entire time of the Czech revolt, the Czech rebellion, the Dubček, and the aftermath of that, the liberalization, and then the clampdown by the Soviet. Why, during the entire time when Czech dissidents were going to jail en masse because they were standing up for liberal democracy, did not a single women's organization? Why did radical feminists in the United States not protest on behalf of the women who were in jail at the time, like myself? And this scholar got up, to her credit, and she said, I apologize for that. But we thought, as progressives, that if we criticized the Soviet Union for this, and if we came out on your behalf, you who were advocating the values of the United States of America, that we would be discrediting socialism.
Wow.
That's what she said. And I believe that psychology is still at work on campuses, in newspapers. You cannot discredit socialism. And that's what, to my mind, that maybe that's not the only reason, but that is a important reason why these attacks on Jews are not ever mentioned. Because once you start mentioning them and start looking into them, then you have to start questioning the values out of which those attacks came. Then you have to start thinking about America in maybe a different light, or what America used to be, at least, perhaps not now. And it can start to break apart a coalition of groups that are committed to, quote unquote, progressive values. And it's a very difficult problem. Very, very difficult.
I don't know if this is a case of history repeating or history never changing.
I'd say history never changes because we don't change. Yes, we eat differently than the Neanderthals did. We do certain kinds of things differently. I understand we just invented cold fusion, which is wonderful. That may be the breakthrough thing of our lifetime or your lifetime. I'm not going to see it turn into, global consumption. But nevertheless, we don't really change. And if you have been following at all the antics of the right-wing Republicans in the United States Senate and House, you see that people who know better, people who have one set of views privately that they talk to their wives and their children about, say something diametrically different when they get up on the stand and start talking to their followers because of politics and the way power actually works. And power eliminates the individual. It essentially eliminates conscience. We say, don't you have a conscience? Don't you think you're a hypocrite? No, they're not hypocrites. Not at all. They actually believe what they believe. I mean, some of them do believe these horrible things, but many of them don't. They just go along. It's the go along phenomenon because that's what power is. And they want to retain that power above all things, above all things. And every group does.
Jonathan, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Now, I'm going to ask you a question which I ask to all of our guests, which is, if someone who is not Jewish wants to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start? What should they do?
Well, I think the place to start is to begin understanding what the sources of a lot of this anti-Semitism are, and to support those groups that take a stand and are responsible for putting up resistance of one sort or another to anti-Semitism, either cultural resistance or political resistance or social resistance. But the most important thing that anyone, Jewish or non-Jewish, must do as a free human being, as a free, the word freedom is so degraded in our culture. There are advertisements on television for the freedom machine, which is your Chevrolet or whatever, Buick or whatever it is. The freedom machine. The machine will make you free. Everybody wants to be free. But the single requirement, I believe, for freedom, real freedom, is to think critically. To think critically. To not accept the canards, to not accept the cliches, to not accept the stereotypes, try to get through them, try to get around them, not just those of the other, but of yourself, of how you think about things. And that's the first step. And if we can build a community of people who think critically, that community then begins to gain power. At school boards, in hospitals, in all of those areas of social and political life that in the end make a meaningful difference. One of the great insights that Hitler had was that his anti-Semitism had to start in the kindergarten. Had to start there. And he had to get the nursery school teachers and the kindergarten teachers and then the high school teachers and on and on and on. He had to get the whole range of society saying the same thing. And the only real weapon you have is critical thinking. I believe critical thinking, education, ultimately, different forms of education.
Yeah. Jonathan, please tell the listeners, what has YIVO got going on? What has it got coming up? And where can people find you?
People can find us at 15 West 16th Street in New York City, or they can find us at yivo.org. They can reach me personally through email or by telephone. They can reach the heads of all of our departments directly. if they email. Um, we pride ourselves on being receptive and open to everyone. Um, what have we got going? We have new educational programs. We just today signed an agreement with Vilnius University to establish a master's degree in Yiddish studies that will be between Vilnius University in Lithuania and the YIVO Institute in New York City. We are working with the National Library of Israel on completing the publication of and the digitization of the entire archive of Chaim Grada, the great Yiddish writer. We are working on the construction of what we are going to call a new learning and media center at YIVO. And we are continuing our work on the online museum, the new exhibit of which is going to be based on the diary of Yitzhak Rudashevsky, whom I spoke about earlier. So there's a lot. There's a lot. One of the big projects that I have in mind to do is to create a series of short biographies of Yiddish writers and artists and musicians who were murdered during the Holocaust. We have no idea how much great creative energy was lost to our people, writers, thinkers, musicians. And so we have a skewed idea of what the trajectory of Jewish culture would have been. And so that's something that I want to get underway.
Yeah. Yeah, you also have 24 million documents. There's something for everyone, really. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Against Anti-Semitism. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.